first was, is Russia's non-proliferation policy in the area of civil nuclear cooperation adequately aligned to international standards and norms? The second question was, do Russian and American approaches to non-proliferation allow for the development of a common strategy to combat proliferation? And is this current level of proliferation cooperation sufficient to strengthen the global non-proliferation efforts? And then lastly, I was interested in how civil nuclear cooperation is involved with U.S.-Russian relations, how it impacts U.S.-Russian relations. And my key conclusions are threefold. First, one, that civil nuclear cooperation can strengthen the global non-proliferation framework. And from the Russian perspective, primarily because several of the key areas of cooperation align very closely with Russia's non-proliferation policy and with their national interest. And then secondly, because while previous bilateral actions have unquestionably strengthened non-proliferation efforts and efforts to combat proliferation, and the level of civil nuclear cooperation has increased in recent years, I also found my research indicated that while this has occurred, the recent joint civil nuclear cooperation efforts has not had a transformative effect on the international non-proliferation framework as a whole. And then similarly, while civil nuclear cooperation has increased the frequency and scope of bilateral interactions, it has played a relatively minor role in the overall U.S.-Russian relationship. So before I continue, I think it will be helpful to discuss some terminology with regard to civil nuclear cooperation. And in following this, I'm going to just give a very brief overview of the history of civil nuclear cooperation between these two countries. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about Russia's overall non-proliferation policy. And then I'm going to turn towards some of the key areas of non-proliferation as it pertains to the civil nuclear industry, and what activities are ongoing in those areas, and how bilateral cooperation impacts those areas. So to begin with some terminology, what do I mean by civil nuclear cooperation? It's just what it sounds. It's the spectrum of cooperation between two countries in the field of civil nuclear energy. And this can cover the complete spectrum from commercial interaction to government interaction, and it can involve things such as scientific and technological exchanges. It can also involve areas of purchasing and selling of nuclear fuel services. So basically the whole spectrum of civil nuclear cooperation. And from the U.S. perspective, in order to have a very deep and productive cooperation agreement with a foreign country, it must have a formal established agreement in place with that country, and that meets certain criteria. And this is commonly referred to as the 1-2-3 agreement from the United States. And up until recently, the U.S. has not had a 1-2-3 agreement with Russia until 2011, and I'll talk more about that briefly. The second term I want to just briefly touch on is this concept of a nuclear fuel cycle. And what that is simply the life cycle of nuclear fuel, from the time uranium comes out of the ground to the time it's processed and made into nuclear fuel, to when it's actually used in a nuclear reactor, to then when it comes out of the nuclear reactor as spent fuel, and what is done with that at that point. So, well, enough terminology now. Moving on to the history of, I'm going to just talk very briefly about the history of civil nuclear cooperation. And really in the 90s is when this really started. But in the 90s, the focus was on security, securing nuclear materials, securing nuclear weapons. And there were a couple of key initiatives that came about in this period. One was the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, also known as the NUNLUGR, which covered the whole spectrum of security issues dealing with weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet Union. And by all accounts, it was a great success. And the second program was called Megatons to Megawatts. And this was really a novel program which took highly enriched uranium, weapons-grade uranium from nuclear weapons in Russia, and downblended that into low-enriched uranium, which then could be used in the United States nuclear reactors. So today, 10% of our entire electric generation in the United States comes from Russian nuclear weapons, which I think is quite remarkable. So, but outside of these immediate security areas, there was little civil nuclear cooperation. And this period really the relationship can be defined as a donor-recipient type of relationship. And the largest impediment to developing closer ties and to reaching a 1-2-3 agreement with Russia was the issue of Iran. And so it wasn't until 2006 when formal negotiations began with the United States and Russia on reaching a 1-2-3 agreement. And this came about from the U.S. perspective for a few reasons. One, Russia had strengthened its policies towards Iran, at least to fit the criteria specified by the law, the U.S. law. And also this was a period too when nuclear energy was increasingly being seen worldwide as a viable option for meeting future energy needs. And then there was also a general recognition of the proliferation threat in the world. So these issues kind of combined and really promoted this idea in the United States of reaching a 1-2-3 agreement with Russia. Now, the 1-2-3 agreement was signed initially in May of 2008, but then the Russia-Georgia war happened, and so the Bush administration pulled back this agreement. So it wasn't then until January of 2011, under the Bohn administration, where it finally came into force. So that was just a very brief overview of the history of the cooperation between the two countries. And now moving on to Russia's non-proliferation policy, broadly speaking. And I've identified three features of its non-proliferation policy as it pertains to civil nuclear energy. First, Russia has an interest in improving its international non-proliferation regimes. However, this is not its main concern, and therefore Moscow evaluates non-proliferation and non-proliferation cooperation within the context of its other security and political considerations. Secondly, Russia seeks to develop non-proliferation approaches that are advantageous to its interests. However, Moscow will resist strengthening other non-proliferation regimes that undermine its political or economic interests. And then lastly, Russia seeks to participate in international non-proliferation regimes and groups on a peer-to-peer basis rather than, as it had in the 90s, on a donor-recipient basis. So in the 1990s, under Yeltsin, Russia's non-proliferation policy was obviously weak. It was weak as a reflection of the weak state at that point. And they had poor export controls, they had poor security measures. But this really began to strengthen, I think, in the late 1990s. And then it continued to strengthen under President Putin. They passed and enacted export control laws and various security measures, which did improve their overall approach to non-proliferation. And importantly, too, Russia's policy towards Iran strengthened during this period, and from what it had been in the mid-1990s. But again, although it strengthened over time, it has still remained erratic somewhat and inconsistent. And the final point I'll note on Russia's non-proliferation policy is that it does participate in most of the international non-proliferation regimes. However, despite significant progress it's made since the 1990s, Russia in itself is still a proliferation concern in various areas, such as smuggling, for instance. So moving on now I'm going to talk about some key non-proliferation issues and what Russia is doing in these various areas, and then how civil nuclear cooperation is being impacting these areas. So the first is the issue of enrichment. And just very, very briefly speaking, enrichment means in order for uranium to operate effectively in a nuclear reactor, you have to increase the percentage of radioactive isotopes of that uranium. And to do that, you have to go through a process of enrichment. So the issue really, globally speaking, is how to prevent the spread of enrichment technologies and capabilities. Because the main concern really is that if a new country develops enrichment technology to produce low-enriched uranium, which is then used in civil nuclear reactors, they can then take that technology and advance it to be able to create highly enriched uranium, which then can lead to weapons-grade uranium for the production of nuclear weapons. So this is the main concern. And among the major players in the international scene, there is a general agreement that they need to address this issue. And one way to address that is to create a system of assured supplies of nuclear fuel for countries, so they will feel comfortable foregoing their enrichment capabilities. And to this end, Russia has really taken the lead in some ways. It has established the first multilateral international uranium enrichment center, and along with that, it's developed a fuel bank, a nuclear fuel bank as well. And this is really in keeping with the United States' efforts and other countries during this period as well. The United States created a fuel bank, for example, and other countries are developing similar ideas of providing assured fuel to other countries. But despite the general agreement on what needs to be done in this area, there has actually been literal or little bilateral cooperation to achieve this. And there has been very little direct coordination and discussion on developing a unified system of enrichment facilities that provides assured supplies of nuclear fuel to countries that want to develop nuclear energy, but don't want to develop their enrichment capability. So moving on now to another issue of reprocessing. This is then relates to the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. An issue here is what to do with the spent fuel after it comes out of the reactor, and how to minimize the effects of and the proliferation risk of that. Because the concern is when spent fuel contains plutonium, and the concern is if what is done with that plutonium after it comes out. And opponents of reprocessing argue that it will increase the proliferation risk because you are exposing that plutonium to the potential for diverting that for other uses. And so Russia and the United States have different views on this. Russia operates what's called a closed control, or a closed nuclear fuel cycle. And in this, they want to recycle all of the spent fuel and reprocess that so they can then reuse that as nuclear fuel in reactors. And they're not alone in this. The United Kingdom does this, France does this, Japan does this. So they're not alone with pursuing this approach. However, the U.S. does not. The U.S. has a once through an open fuel cycle where they do not seek to reprocess that fuel, and rather than just keep it in storage instead. And they view, and the reason for this is that they view this as a proliferation risk, because when you reprocess a fuel traditionally, you are extracting the pure plutonium. So there's a concern there that could be a proliferation risk in other countries. And but I will note, however, that new technologies are emerging that are making reprocessing less of a proliferation risk. And I'll just add, the U.S. was, up until very recently, considering pursuing this option, considering closing their fuel cycle, because they were seeing some of the advantage of this. They were seeing the developments in technology. So there was an effort beginning really in the mid-2000s to pursue this avenue. However, recently the Department of Energy decided that they would remain with the open fuel cycle, that it would at this time not pursue the closed fuel cycle. So therefore, the cooperation between Russia and the United States in this area remains relatively low, and will likely to be relatively low in the future, despite the initial hopes that this would be an area of deep cooperation potential for Russia and the United States. So the next issue then is reactor development. And the issue here is how to make reactors more proliferation resistant, and then how to deal with the global expansion of nuclear plants throughout the world. And the concern here is that new reactors, particularly ones in new countries, will increase the proliferation risk. And really, Russia is at this point really taking the lead for developing reactor technology. Of note, their new fast neutron reactor, which is currently being developed, which it views as being more potentially proliferation resistant than traditional methods. The other issue, another approach that Russia is taking to this is with regard to its construction of overseas nuclear facilities, is this concept called build, own, operate. And build, own, operate is just that. You build, not only do you build and construct a nuclear power plant overseas, once it's completed, you continue to operate it, and you maintain majority ownership of it. And then you will provide the assured supplies of nuclear fuel, and then the spent fuel will be then returned to Russia. And so the first build and operate facility is slated for Turkey. And so this is potentially a way to expand nuclear power worldwide while still minimizing the proliferation risk associated with nuclear power. And this is important too, because the U.S. is currently also constructing new reactors in the United States. And this is the first time since I think the 70s where new reactors have been built in the United States. So this is an area where cooperation remains relatively high between Russia and the United States, and particularly in the security area. For example, Russia and the United States are jointly working together to transform Russia's highly enriched uranium research reactors to low enriched uranium. And this, of course, will mean a less of a proliferation risk associated with the highly enriched uranium at these research reactors. And so what do all these issues tell us about the state of Russia's policy? One is that Russia's non-proliferation policy offers several areas in which cooperation with the U.S. could lead to an international fuel cycle that is more proliferation resistant. However, a close policy alignment doesn't necessarily translate into substantive cooperation. And secondly, cooperation is most fruitful in technical areas related to security of nuclear material. And the likely reason for this is that because there's a long history of cooperation in this sphere. And additionally, cooperation in addressing overall proliferation issues remains limited. And it typically occurs within international structures such as the IAEA, not bilaterally. So, and then lastly, although the 123 agreement has only a marginal impact on non-proliferation cooperation, the frequency and breadth of bilateral interaction is slowly increasing. And this incrementalism may help deepen and expand cooperation in select areas where interests overlap. So moving on, and I'll conclude now with just a brief discussion on the civil nuclear cooperation and how that factors into the U.S.-Russian relationship. And as I mentioned earlier, it does not really occupy a high position in the overall U.S.-Russian relationship. It has not had a transformative effect on the relationship. And although, for example, the initial signing of the 123 agreement, coupled with the signing of New START, did provide some momentum in this relationship, it did not really. That was proved to be short-lived. It did not have a lasting effect. And despite some expectations, it is not immune to politics. And we've seen the worsening in relationships has likely reduced the political space in which rapid cooperation, rapid expansion of bilateral cooperation is possible. But I guess I'll leave and conclude on a positive note. And that is civil nuclear cooperation has increased in recent years, as I've mentioned, in terms of frequency of interactions, in terms of the number of joint projects. And this enduring engagement may provide an institutional framework for bilateral cooperation, which then can be applied in principle to other policy areas. So that concludes my presentation, pending your questions.
That's great. Exactly within 20 minutes. Let me just ask you the first question. I know that you've looked into the Bilateral Presidential Commission that we have, and obviously this is one of the working groups, right? Do they have concrete projects, or is this still very much in the beginning stage? They're talking about the possibility of concrete projects.
Within the structure of the bilateral?
Within the structure of the bilateral.
There is, and in the way, just for some background, there is within the Presidential Bilateral Commission that was set up by President Medvedev and Obama, there is a working group for nuclear energy and nuclear security. And within that, there's a whole series of sub-working groups. And these working groups consist of different government agencies. So some of these projects are maybe ongoing, which were started, for example, by the National Nuclear Security Administration. So there's some overlap there. It's not necessarily concrete that they were started as a result of the commission, but they were that provides the structural framework for those engagements. There are within the commission itself, there is various projects. They have meetings, periodic meetings, and kind of working groups. They bring scientists in together to work. And within the specific sub-working groups, they do have concrete projects. And for example, one of the ones I mentioned earlier, and again, there's some overlap because of the departmental overlap, but one of the milestones of this commission was the creation of an agreement for dealing with this highly enriched uranium at these research reactors. So that occurs, generally speaking, within a framework of the Bilateral Commission, but again, it's also reflective of ongoing efforts by the individual agencies, Department of Energy and Department of Defense for the reduction. So there's some bureaucratic overlap in that sense. But in general, we have seen that has produced, I think, an increased level of interaction, whether it be projects or just meetings, but generally speaking, it is has increased the level of interactions.
Questions? Yes.
I was wondering, my question is kind of twofold. First, you mentioned Russia's nuclear deal with Turkey, and I was wondering whether or not the third-party cooperation that Russia has with other countries, or the United States has with other countries, whether that will have any effect on U.S.-Russia civil nuclear cooperation, and conversely, whether or not the desire to keep good civil nuclear cooperation between those two countries will affect which third parties each country chooses to engage with on the nuclear issue?
I mean, the short answer to that is yes. And a good example of that is Russia's cooperation with Iran. But we are seeing that the bilateral cooperation between Russia and the United States is definitely influencing. And it is hard to draw a line between it, whether that's civil nuclear cooperation or just cooperation in general. But we are seeing that that is influencing decisions for where, which countries that either Russia or the United States will seek to build nuclear facilities. And Russia's position is that if it will only deal business with a country that is signatories to the NPT or meets the IAEA requirements. So it is strongly invested in the IAEA framework for requirements for these countries to develop nuclear technology. And so I don't see Russia. Russia is actively trying to, for both economic and political reasons, trying to expand their overseas presence. And I mean, they're talking about building reactors in places like Bangladesh. So, I think this may be consistent with their, be friends with everybody policy. But obviously, those final decisions will be in some way a factor of U.S.-Russian relations.
Other questions?
With these agreements that Russia has for building, operating, and owning reactors in other countries, what kinds of mechanisms are in place to regulate these relationships over the long term? What guarantees, in other words, exist that the relationships won't change and perhaps the countries themselves would be more involved in the manufacturing?
Yeah, and that is actually one of the main concerns, not necessarily with the build and operate concept, but in general, with expanding nuclear power. With the build and operate, it right now, as far as I understand, it's contractual. So it will be, but there's nothing, I don't think, prohibiting, for example, Turkey, if they would have some unforeseeable circumstance where they would want to sever Russia's ownership of that, it would essentially be nationalizing that power plant. However, then you have to deal with the repercussions of that. How do you get the fuel if you're depending on the fuel from Russia? Well, now you can't get that fuel. But that touches on the bigger issue of how what happens when countries that hadn't had nuclear power suddenly develop and they have this nuclear power capability. And opponents of civil nuclear expansion argue that it changes their calculus. Once they develop nuclear capacity for civilian purposes, it changes their political calculus to where they then start, where they may have never considered nuclear weapons, for example, before. It may lead to a situation where they feel themselves in a new geopolitical position with it, and therefore may seek to develop weapons. I personally don't agree with that because just the statistics don't really hold. The evidence doesn't really necessarily hold true for that, but that is one of the main concerns.
Other questions? Well, I'll ask you one more. So, in the 90s, the Clinton administration got very concerned about Russia supporting the Boucher project, right? And in the beginning of the Bush administration, they were also concerned, and then at some point, they said, that's fine, we understand what you're doing, it's okay. What accounts for this kind of transformation? Because obviously that's not, what's the phrase used for Turkey, a build and operate plant. That's obviously not what they're doing in Boucher. So why did we change our view of that?
Well, I think part of it was Russia had taken some measures at the insistence of the United States to limit the amount of support they were giving. For example, in 2005, they struck a deal with Iran to have the spent fuel that was coming out of Boucher to be returned to Russia. Now that Boucher's been online for a couple of years now, and we haven't seen that happen. So, but again, the time span of how long it remains in there is somewhat questionable. So that'll be something we'll be watching for. But Russia took some steps for that, and also too, I think what was the discussions that were occurring at the time in the government in the mid-2000s were, one, we obviously wanted Russia to do more, and so how to use the 1-2-3 agreement to achieve this. Some proposed that we withhold it from Russia until they fully stop their cooperation with Iran, and the other the other side argued that no, in fact, if they were a member of, if they had a 1, 2, 3 agreement with the United States, that would actually incentivize Russia to, and would give them a vested interest in cooperating more with the United States to restrict Iran's access to sensitive material. And that was really one of the main concerns in the later stages of the 2000s was this transfer of sensitive technology. And so I think the latter group won out in this in the United States government, and I think I agree with that position where it's more advantageous for us to have a formal agreement with Russia, because it does give them these incentives and this vested interest in dealing with Iran on a stricter basis than it had. Because the assumption of not having a withholding 1, 2, 3 agreement implies that Russia needs it more than we do. And then that really wasn't the case, as Russia demonstrated. They can live without a 1, 2, 3 agreement with the United States. So that was really not an effective leverage.
Great. Thank you very much.